Hi everyone, I'm Madhichanuka Kanwana and I'm a part of the Gampha Medical Students Association, the GMSCM 2019 batch. So today I'm going to conduct a part of the lesson coordination and homeostasis, and I will be conducting the second part of the lesson, which is human sensory structures and functions. Coming to the lesson, first we have to know what is a sensory receptor. There's a standard definition for that. A sensory receptor is a specialized structure which can detect a specific stimulus and convert the stimulus energy to a change in membrane potential to be transmitted to the central nervous system as action potentials for sensory perception and interpretation. So the meaning of this is that a receptor is specialized to detect a particular specific stimulus, and then it can convert the energy of the stimulus to an electric nerve impulse and transmit it to the central nervous system, the brain and spinal cord, as an action potential, that means as a nerve impulse for sensory perception. That is the meaning of this definition. Then a sensory receptor can be a specialized cell, an organ, or a subcellular structure. So receptors can be found in all these three forms. And we have to know that there are receptors that can detect fluctuations within the internal environment of the body, and they are internal receptors, and there are some other specific sensor receptors that can detect stimuli of the external environment. There are 6 basic characteristics of sensor receptors. First, a specialized structure designed to receive a specific stimulus. That was mentioned in the definition as well. Detect the stimulus if the stimulus is at or above the threshold level. The stimulus should be either equal to the threshold level or above that. If not, if the stimulus is below the threshold level, then that stimulus cannot be detected by the receptor. Then third one, convert the energy of the stimulus to a change in membrane potential to be later transmitted as an action potential. Then fourth one, always connected with the nervous system. Then fifth one, amplification. Amplification means the sensory signal can be strengthened by the receptors. That means they can act as amplifiers and amplify or strengthen the sensory signal during the conversion of the energy of the stimulus into the action potential. That ability is called amplification. Then sensory adaptation. Sensory adaptation means the decrease in responsiveness due to the continuous stimulation. Now, when we are exposed to a strong smell, with time, within a few minutes, the perception gradually reduces. That is because we get used to that smell. So likewise, the receptors also get used to a particular stimulus, and the responsiveness towards that stimulus reduces. So that is called sensory adaptation. Then types of sensory receptors. There are 5 main types of chemical receptors. There are 5 main types of sensory receptors. There are 5 main types of sensory receptors depending on the type of stimulus detected. Namely, chemoreceptors that can detect chemical substances, thermoreceptors that can detect temperature variations, photoreceptors that can detect light, then mechanoreceptors that can detect mechanical energy deformations or mechanical forces in simple, and then pain receptors that can detect harmful conditions like extreme pressure, temperature, or chemicals. Then the first type of receptor is chemoreceptors. Chemoreceptors respond to chemical stimuli, and always the chemical substances should be dissolved in water to be detected by these receptors, unless detection will not happen. Then there are 2 main types of chemoreceptors: taste receptors that can sense taste, and olfactory receptors that can sense smell. But these are not the only 2 types of chemoreceptors, because the body also contains chemoreceptors that can detect specific chemicals just like carbon dioxide. Then first type of chemoreceptors is taste receptors. Taste receptors, human taste receptors, are taste buds of the tongue. So when we consider the tongue, we know that it has a lining of stratified squamous epithelium, and this epithelium has been modified and organized into taste buds at some places of the tongue, and they are found in papillae, which are small projections of the tongue. So in the tongue there are small projections called papillae, and in papillae we can find modified and organized stratified squamous epithelial cells in structures called taste buds. So when we consider a taste bud consists of three main components. They are supporting cells, sensory nerve endings, and taste sensory cells. These supporting cells are actually normal epithelial cells. Taste sensory cells are the modified epithelial cells. And in the taste sensory cells, we can find sensory nerve endings. Then here we can observe the structure of a papilla and the structure of a magnified taste bud. Then we know that it is saliva, which is the surrounding fluid of the sensory receptors. In the tongue, it is saliva that is the surrounding fluid of the sensory receptors. Then when food particles enter the tongue, they should be dissolved in saliva first, and then they are diffused to the receptor cells, and then the receptor cells are stimulated and they create nerve impulses about taste and sent through the nerve fibers through the nerve to the brain, to the related area of the brain, to perceive the sensation of taste. When we consider sensation of taste, there are 5 main sensations of taste. As we all know, they are sweet, sour, bitter, salt, and umami. Umami means savory taste. Then second type of chemoreceptors, olfactory receptors. Here in olfaction, the receptor cells are neurons. The olfactory receptor cells are found within the epithelium of the upper portion of the nasal cavity. So this is the location of olfaction receptor cells. As we all know, there is a mucus layer secreted by goblet cells in the lining of the epithelium. So receptive ends of the sensory receptors extend up to the mucus layer. So it is a mucus layer which contains the watery substances for the chemical substances to dissolve. When the odorants means the substances dissolved in the moist and are to be smelt, get diffused to this region, receptor cells are stimulated and nerve impulses are sent along their axons to the olfactory bulb of the brain. So nerve impulses are received by the olfactory bulb of the brain. So this is the structure of the olfactory receptors, the olfactory epithelium of humans. So we can see that there are sensory nerve endings extending from the olfactory bulb of the brain to the sensory olfactory receptor cells or the sensory cells. And we can also see normal epithelial cells as supportive cells. Olfactory bulb is located deep in the temporal lobe of the brain. The second type of receptors is thermoreceptors. These are specialized temperature sensitive receptors that detect heat and cold both on the body surface and in the internal environment of the body. So there are receptors, actually thermoreceptors, that can detect the temperature variations inside the body as well as on the surface of the body affected by the external environment. So the thermoreceptors that are found on the skin or the thermoreceptors that can detect fluctuations of the body surface are Ruffini corpuscles, Krause and bulbs, and free nerve endings. Ruffini corpuscles can detect warmth or high temperatures. Krause and bulbs can detect cold or low temperatures, whereas free nerve endings can detect both cold and warm. Then the thermoreceptors of the hypothalamus, they are basically specialized neurons, detect variations of core temperature. Core temperature is also called the deep body temperature, and it is a temperature of blood circulating through the internal organs. So the thermoreceptors that can detect internal variations are actually specialized neurons of the hypothalamus. The third type, photoreceptors. These are light sensitive cells. Now humans have two main types of photosensitive cells, rods and cones, and they will be elaborately explained in the part of the ear. Then the fourth type of receptors is mechanoreceptors. Mechanoreceptors respond to stimuli arising from mechanical energy deformations such as pressure, touch, stretch, motion, and sound. Mechanical energy deformations means actually mechanical forces. So according to the type of force, there are three main types of mechanoreceptors. touch receptors, pressure receptors, and vibration receptors. Touch receptors. They are mostly present close to the skin surface. There are three main types of touch receptors: Merkel discs that are sensitive to light touch, Meissner's corpuscles that are sensitive to light pressure, and free nerve endings. Then pressure receptors. Example is Pacinian corpuscles, and they are found in the deep skin. Pressure is rather more deeper than touch. Therefore, Pacinian corpuscles are present in deep skin and they are sensitive to deep pressures. Then vibration receptors. Most of the touch receptors can also detect vibrations, like Pacinian corpuscles, Meissner's corpuscles. They can detect vibrations as well. Now coming to the ear has three vibration receptors. Specific hair cells in organ of Corti in cochlea to detect sound vibrations. And second, vestibule of the inner ear has structures to detect gravity. Actually the structure is macula. And then semicircular canals of inner ear has structures to detect motion. Actually that structure is cupula. So they are the three examples for vibration receptors. Now when the last type of receptors is considered, that is pain receptors. So pain receptors, they detect stimuli that reflect harmful conditions that could arise from extreme pressure, temperature, and certain chemicals that could damage the tissues. Nerve endings in different areas of the body can detect the tissue damage, and pain is ultimately perceived by the brain. So pain receptors detect stimuli that can be harmful to our body due to various reasons like extreme pressures, extreme temperatures, or by certain chemicals, and these things that might damage the body tissues. And when we consider pain receptors are actually specialized nerve endings that are found throughout the body. And if there is some kind of a tissue damage that happens, then these nerve endings are stimulated, they create nerve impulses and send it to the brain, and ultimately pain is received by the brain. So actually that's it about the types of receptors. So now we can move on to the human eye. So this is the basic structure of the human eye. So here, when the human eye wall is considered, there are three main parts of the human eye wall. They are outer fibrous layer, middle vascular layer, and the inner nervous layer. The outer fibrous layer is made up of the sclera and cornea. The middle vascular layer is composed of the choroid, ciliary body, and the iris, and the inner nervous layer is composed of the retina. And also it contains structures like aqueous humor, vitreous humor, and eye lens. Then coming to the locations of all these parts, the sclera is the outermost layer of the eye, posteriorly and laterally, and cornea is the outermost layer anteriorly. Then inner to the cornea we can find the iris, and the whole of the iris is called the pupil, and the eye lens is found immediately behind the pupil. And then when the middle vascular layer is considered, the anterior continuation of the choroid is the ciliary body, and the anterior continuation of the ciliary body is the iris. Iris is found in between cornea and the eye lens, and as I said, the whole of the iris is called the pupil. Then coming to the outer fibrous layer, let's see the detailed explanations. Sclera and cornea. Sclera is white and opaque. Since it's hard, it maintains the shape of the eyeball and gives attachment to extrinsic muscles of the eye. So they are the two main functions of the sclera. Then cornea, it is anteriorly convex. As I said, cornea is the anterior continuation of the sclera. So cornea is anteriorly convex. It is a passageway through which light rays reach the retina. Light rays enter the eye through the cornea and reach the retina. It has no blood vessels. Main function is refraction of light rays to focus on the retina. It supports the eye lens in refraction of light rays. Then the middle vascular layer, choroid. Choroid is located just beneath the sclera. It is a thin pigmented layer and rich with blood vessels. The function is to absorb light rays that fall on the retina in order to prevent the multiple reflection. So that is the function of the choroid layer. Then the ciliary body. So ciliary body is the anterior continuation of the choroid, and it consists of two main things: smooth muscle fibers, which are called ciliary muscles, and sensory epithelial cells. Most of these smooth muscle fibers are circular smooth muscle fibers. Therefore, ciliary muscles can act as a sphincter. That's an important point. Ciliary muscles are circular muscles. The ciliary body holds the lens in place by suspensory ligaments. The size and thickness of the lens can be controlled by the contraction and relaxation of the ciliary muscle fibers attached to the suspensory ligaments. So, this is actually the function of ciliary muscles of the ciliary body. Contraction and relaxations of the ciliary muscles can control the size and thickness of the eye lens. Then the epithelial cells secrete the aqueous humor. That is a function of epithelial cells. Then when the iris is considered, iris is a circular colored body composed of pigmented cells and two layers of smooth muscles. It is located at the front of the eye. So we saw the location of the iris. It is found in between the cornea and the eye lens. It extends anteriorly from the ciliary body and present behind the cornea and in front of the lens, as I said. It contains two layers of smooth muscle fibers which are arranged as circular and radial bundles. So we have to remember that the iris muscles have two layers of smooth muscles. One is circular and the other is radial. In the center of the iris is a hole called the pupil. Iris controls the amount of light entering the pupil by changing the size, which is mediated by the autonomic nervous system. So this is basically the function of the iris. And the pigmented layer, the pigments, prevent the penetration of excessive light. So they are the two main functions of the iris, one of the iris muscles and the other of the pigmented layer. Then comes the lens. Lens is lying immediately behind the pupil. It is an elastic, biconvex, transparent disc made up of protein enclosed with a transparent capsule. So they are the basic features of the lens. It refracts light rays refracted by objects in front of the eye and focuses them on the retina to form the image. So when we consider the eye lens is the main agent of refraction, and it is supported by cornea and aqueous humor and conjunctiva. Then, by changing the thickness, the lens can vary its refractive power in order to focus rays on the retina. So the thickness is actually changed by the contractions and relaxations of the ciliary muscles of the ciliary body. Then the aqueous fluid or the aqueous humor and the vitreous body or the vitreous humor. So simply aqueous fluid is found in front of the lens and vitreous humor is found behind the lens. In front of the lens, a clear watery substance is present, which is called the aqueous fluid. Aqueous fluid supplies nutrients and removes waste from cornea, lens and lens capsule, which have no blood supply. So that is the function of the aqueous fluid. Then, as evident, vitreous humor is a relatively hard structure. So the colorless and transparent jelly-like substance behind the lens is a vitreous humor. It's a relatively hard structure because it is a semi-solid. It's a transparent jelly-like substance, so it is a semi-solid. So it's a semi-solid, so it's hard. So main function is to maintain enough intraocular pressure to support the retina against the choroid and also prevents the eyeball from collapsing. So they are the two main functions of the vitreous body. Blockage of the ducts that drain this fluid means the aqueous fluid can produce glaucoma, causing vision loss. So when the ducts that drain, actually now aqueous fluid is secreted by the epithelial layer of choroid, epithelial layer of the ciliary body, and when the ducts that drain this fluid are blocked, that can produce a condition called glaucoma, causing vision loss. Then the inner neuron layer, which is the retina. So when we consider the retina, this is the structure of a retina, and there are three layers of the retina: outer pigmented layer, middle photoreceptive layer, and the inner neuron layer. Middle photoreceptive layer has two types of cells. two types of photosensitive receptor cells. They are rods and cones, and the inner neuron layer consists of two types of cells. They are bipolar cells and ganglion cells, and also we can find nerve fibers, optic nerve fibers in the inner neuron layer. So when the middle photoreceptive layer is considered, the photoreceptor layer consists of two types of sensory cells, the rods and the cones. So they are the photosensitive cells. They contain photosensory pigments that can convert light rays into nerve impulses. Retina is thickest at the back. At the center of the posterior part of the retina, macula lutea or the yellow spot is present. In the center of the yellow spot, there is a little depression called fovea centralis, which contains only cones and no rods. That means when the retina is considered, the posterior portion of the retina is thickest. The lateral portions are relatively thinner than the posterior portion. Then at the center of this posterior part, there is an area called yellow spot or macula lutea. And at the center of the yellow spot, there is a little depression called the fovea centralis, and it contains only cones and no rods. That means they participate in color vision only. Towards the anterior part of the retina, there are fewer cones than rods. That means the lateral portions of the retina contains more rods than cones. About 0.5 centimeters to the nasal side of the macula lutea, all the nerve fibers of the retina converge to form the optic nerve. The small area of the retina where the optic nerve leaves the eye is the blind spot or the optic disc. So blind spot means a small area of the retina where the optic nerve leaves the eye, and it lacks photoreceptors. There are no photoreceptors in the blind spot. Then when talking elaborately about the photoreceptor cells and the neurons of the retina, photoreceptor cells are of two types, rods and cones. We said that. Within the outer segment of these cells is a stack of membranous discs in which visual pigments are embedded. So, when we consider the outer segment of these cells, they contain stacks of membranous discs. Actually, the arrangement of the outer segment in rods is rod-shaped, and that of the cones is cone-shaped. That is why the names have been derived. And these stacks of membranous discs contain visual pigments. In retina, more rods are present than cones. When the overall number is considered, the number of rods is greater than the number of cones. In the rods, visual pigment is rhodopsin. They are sensitive to light but do not distinguish colors. They enable us to see at night but only in black and white. In cones, the visual pigment is photopsin, and it's the opposite of rods. They provide color vision. They contribute very little to night vision as they are less sensitive. Now, when rods are considered, they are more sensitive to light because they can give vision. They can give vision even at low light intensities. But since they cannot distinguish colors, they cannot give color vision. So, they enable us to see at night in black and white. Then when cones are considered, cones can distinguish colors, therefore they can provide color vision, but they can act properly only in bright light. Therefore, they are less sensitive to light. Therefore, they contribute very little to night vision. And when cones are considered, there are three types of cones which has this different sensitivity across the visible spectrum, providing an optimal response to red, green or blue light. That means there are three types of cones, and each of these cones can distinguish three different colors, red, green or blue light. So accordingly, there are three types of cones. Then when the neurons are considered, what all we have to know is that in the neuron layer there are two types of cells, bipolar cells and ganglion cells. So now we can move on to the functioning of the human eyes. Light is refracted into the eye by the objects in the field of vision. In order to achieve clear vision, light refracted from the object within the visual field should be refracted mainly by the lens and focused on retina of each eye. Refraction should happen and proper focusing on the retina should happen. There are the processes which are involved in producing a clear image on the retina are refraction of light rays, change in the size of pupil and accommodation. So these three processes are imperative to happen in order to produce a clear image. Then photoreceptor cells in the retina convert light energy to voltage changes leading to action potentials which are sent through the optic nerve to the brain for perception of visual objects. When light falls on retina, photoreceptor cells, the photosensitive pigments are stimulated and they produce a nerve impulse which is sent to the brain, actually to the occipital lobe of the brain via the optic nerve. In the retina, stimulation of rods lead to black and white vision. Cones are sensitive to light and color, therefore bright light is needed to activate them and give a sharp, clear color vision. In order to achieve a sharp, clear color vision, cones should be activated. For that, bright light should be present. The different wavelengths of visible light activate light-sensitive pigments in the cones which result in perception of different colors. That means when a red color light is present, the red color light can stimulate the cones which are sensitive to red. So then red can be perceived by the brain. So likewise that happens. Then the first process required, refraction of light. Light rays coming from the visual field pass through the conjunctiva first, then successively through the cornea, aqueous fluid, lens and the vitreous body before reaching the retina. During this process, light rays are refracted or bent to focus them on the retina as they all are denser than air. Since light rays are denser than air, refraction can happen through the lens. Lens has a change in refractory power while all the other parts, conjunctiva, cornea, aqueous fluid and vitreous body have constant refractory powers. Light rays are mostly refracted by the biconvex lens. Biconvex lens is a main agent of refraction and it is also supported by conjunctiva, cornea, aqueous fluid and the vitreous body. The biconvex lens can change refractory power while other parts have constant refractory powers. Then after refraction, for clear vision, there are two things that should be done. The amount of light entering the eye is controlled by changing the size of pupil, which is mediated by the autonomic nervous system. It is done by the contractions and relaxations of the iris muscles mediated by the autonomic nervous system. So it controls the amount of light entering the eye. Then the other one is accommodation. Accommodation can change the size and thickness of the eye lens, hence controlling the refractory power of the lens, and it ensures the proper focusing of light rays on the retina for clear vision. Then moving to the second process, changing the size of pupil. Here, what matters to the size of pupil or the iris muscles is the light intensity, whether it is bright light or dim light. So in bright light, the pupils are constricted to avoid entering too much light into the eye and damage the sensitive retina. Now for this, circular muscles of the iris should contract and radial muscles should relax. Whereas in dim light, the pupils are dilated. It's the opposite. For this, circular muscles are relaxed and radial muscles are contracted. So as you can see in this diagram, in bright light, in the left side, there it is the eye in bright light. There we can see that the pupil has been constricted, which means the pupil has become small, and that has happened because the circular muscles have contracted and radial muscles have relaxed. Therefore, it causes the size of the aperture to reduce. Then, in the case of dim light, in the right side, we can see that the pupil has enlarged. The pupil has become large, that means the pupil has dilated, and it has happened due to the relaxation of circular muscles and contraction of radial muscles. It is important to remember what happens to the iris muscle in each of the cases. Then movement of the eyeball or convergence. Now this is not considered as a separate process, but this is also important for clear vision. As light rays from near objects enter the two eyes at different angles, for clear vision they must stimulate corresponding areas of the two retina. That means when the two retinas are considered, corresponding areas, so actually the similar areas of the two retinas should be stimulated for clear vision. So for that, muscles attached to the eyeball rotate the eyes to achieve convergence. The eyeball is rotated to a particular angle so that the light rays hit the retina at corresponding places. This is called convergence. Now this happens under autonomic control. This is involuntarily done. Then when the third process is considered, that is change in the refractory power of the lens or accommodation, parasympathetic nervous supply to ciliary body controls a contraction of ciliary muscles and the accommodation of the eye. Accommodation is important in near vision for focusing on near objects. Actually, when our eye is considered, when we are not focusing on any object, then our eye is in relaxed position. Now when we consider distant vision or far vision, there also our eye remain relaxed. Our eyes remain relaxed. So in that case, there are no need of special adjustments in far vision. It is in near vision that special adjustments should be done. So in near vision, the ciliary muscles contract, thereby moving the ciliary body inwards towards the lens. As a result, convexity of the lens is increased due to the reduction of the pull of the suspensory ligaments on the lens. So curvature increases, hence the focal length decreases and the power increases. Thus light waves from near objects are focused on the retina. That is the outline. In far vision, the completely opposite thing happens. Ciliary muscles relax, so ciliary body moves away from the lens, increases the pull on the suspensory ligaments, so the convexity of the lens is reduced, which means curvature is reduced, then the focal length increases and the power decreases. So light rays from distant objects are focused on the retina. So just look at these two diagrams in comparison. On the left side it is distant vision. If we look at that, cilia are relaxed, so the ciliary muscles move away, which means suspensory ligaments are pulled or suspensory ligaments increase in tension. Then the lens, it is like the lens is being pulled from the upper and the lower end. So what happens? The lens becomes thin. That means the curvature decreases or the convexity decreases. In that case, focal length increases and the power of the eye reduces. So in distant vision, we can see a small power, a relatively small power is attained in distant vision. Then in near vision, on the right side, we can see that the ciliary muscles are contracted. That means they move towards the lens. Then it causes the suspensory ligaments to slack, or the tension of the suspensory ligaments reduce and they slack. Then what happens? The lens becomes thick, the lens bulges out. When the lens becomes thick, the curvature or the convexity increases. Then focal length decreases and the power of the eye increases. So in near vision, we can obtain a high power for the eye lens. So the next part, focusing the image on the retina and converting the light energy to action potential to be transmitted to the brain. Light waves coming from the object are refracted and focused on the retina. So this process produces an image on the retina which is upside down. So the image formed by the retina is inverted, that is upside down. Once light rays reach the retina, chemical changes happen in photoreceptive cells, which are rods and cones. So bipolar cells receive information from the photoreceptor cells, and each ganglion cell gathers inputs from several bipolar cells. In addition, specific neurons in the retina can integrate information across the retina. So simply, specific neurons and several bipolar cells together give each ganglion cell the inputs received from the photoreceptor cells. Then ganglion cells form the optic nerve fibers that transmit sensation from eyes as action potential to the brain. So this will generate a nerve impulse. So ganglion cells together form the optic nerve fibers that form the optic nerve, and the impulse and the action potential generated is transmitted to the brain as a nerve impulse regarding that particular object. Then the optic nerve transmits the nerve impulse into the occipital lobes. Actually, the visual area in the occipital lobes of the cerebrum, there the visual objects are perceived in the correct way. That means the upside down inverted image created by the retina is erected out and perceived in the correct way by the visual area of the occipital lobes of the brain. Then in all these things, the choroid functions in absorption of light after the entered light stimulate sensory receptors in the retina. I mentioned this earlier as well. This is the function of the pigmented epithelium of choroid. This can prevent the multiple reflection of light rays inside the eyeball. Then the next part, monocular vision and binocular vision in human. So simply monocular vision means seeing an object using only one eye, and binocular vision means seeing an object using both eyes. In humans, both eyes are located in front of the face, which facilitates coordinated vision from two eyes. But however, it is possible to see visual fields with only using one eye as well. Seeing the visual field using one eye is called monocular vision. However, when one eye is used, three-dimensional vision is impaired, especially in relation to the judgment of speed and distance, which means in monocular vision, faults can happen. Seeing the visual field using two eyes with greater overlapping fields of view is called binocular vision. So when we consider binocular vision, the left eye views more of the left side, right eye views more of the right side. Actually, there are three visual fields, not two. Three visual fields are involved in binocular vision: the left field view, right field view, and the middle field view, which is formed by the overlapping of the left and right views. However, only one image is perceived due to the fusion of left, middle, and the right of the visual field images from the two eyes in the occipital lobe of the cerebrum. No matter how many field views are there, we see only one image because of the fusion of those three visual field images. Unlike monocular vision, binocular vision enables three-dimensional views. So binocular vision is very important in judging the speed and distance of an approaching object such as a vehicle. It gives more accurate assessment of one object relative to another in relation to distance, depth, height, and width. So actually binocular vision can give more accurate assessment about various parameters when a comparison happens. In some individuals, binocular vision may be impaired. So such individuals face difficulties to judge the speed and distance of an approaching object. So this is a diagram that shows the visual fields. So here we can see that the left eye carries more of the left visual fields, right eye carries more of the right visual fields, and in the middle there is an overlapping. But when we consider the occipital lobe of the brain, the right portion of the occipital lobe of the brain receives images from the left field view, whereas the left portion of the occipital lobe receives visual fields from the right visual field. The reason is the optic nerves, the two optic nerves of the left eye and the right eye overlap at a place called optic chiasma. They actually intersect. They intersect at a place called optic chiasma, and the optic nerve of the left eye reaches the right portion of the occipital lobe, and the optic nerve of the right eye reaches the left part of the occipital lobe of the brain. That is the reason why the above thing happens. That is the reason why the right portion of the brain receives the left view, and the left portion of the brain receives the right visual field. Then comes the human ear. So this is the basic structure of the human ear, and there are three main parts of the human ear: the external ear, middle ear, and the inner ear. Then when the outer ear or the external ear is considered, outer ear is composed of three main parts: the pinna, external auditory canal, and the tympanic membrane. The pinna is actually a yellow elastic cartilage lined by the human skin, and the external auditory canal is also lined by the hairy skin, and it has a slightly S shape. It is lined by the hairy skin, therefore it has modified sweat glands named ceruminous glands, which can secrete earwax, which is also called the cerumen. It is important for the protection of the inner parts of the ear. Then the innermost portion is a tympanic membrane, which is a soft membrane and is not lined by the hairy skin, and that separates the outer ear from the middle ear. Then the middle ear. Middle ear is also called the tympanic cavity, and it is found within the temporal bone. It is an air-filled cavity found within the temporal bone. It is not lined by the human hairy skin. It is not lined by the hairy skin, but it is lined by a simple epithelium. And when the medial wall is considered, that means a wall that is closer to the inner ear, that wall consists of two openings, namely oval window and the round window. Then the middle ear consists of three bony ossicles. There are three small ear ossicles, bony ossicles, named malleus, incus and stapes. Malleus is connected to the tympanic membrane, and stapes is actually connected to the medial wall, and stapes covers the oval window. Stapes covers the oval window. And when the round window is considered, round window is covered by a fine fibrous tissue. Round window is covered by a fine fibrous tissue. Then the vibrations of the tympanic membrane are amplified by the middle ear, and the amplified vibrations are sent to the inner ear via the oval window. Then when the internal ear is considered, this is also found within the temporal bone. So actually now the temporal bone has been carved in order to have this internal ear. So here the internal ear is actually a network of fluid filled membranes, and the shape of these membranes are identical. The shapes of the membranes are identical to the bony carvings of the temporal bone, which means the shape of the carving of the bone is identical to the shape of the membrane. So in that case, in the internal ear we can find two portions, a bony portion and a membranous portion. The bony portion is called the bony labyrinth, and the membranous portion is called the membranous labyrinth. So in this diagram we can clearly see that in purple color it is a bony labyrinth, and in blue color it is a membranous labyrinth. So when we consider the ear, there are three compartments of the internal ear: vestibule, three semicircular canals, and the cochlea. Vestibule has two parts, utricle and saccule. So as we can see, the utricle is continuous with the three semicircular canals, and the saccule is continuous with the cochlea. When the semicircular canals are considered, there are three semicircular canals, and they are arranged in three perpendicular planes or three spatial planes. Then at the place where the semicircular canals are attached to the utricle of the vestibule, we can see that there are three swellings. Those swellings are called as ampullae, and these ampullae contain structures called cupula, which is important for the equilibrium of the body. Then when the cochlea is considered, cochlea is a coiled tubular structure. The coiled tubular part is the cochlea, and when we consider this cochlea, actually when we consider the whole inner ear, in the whole inner ear, the membranous labyrinth is filled with a fluid called endolymph. So endolymph is a fluid that is found within the membranous labyrinth portion of the whole inner ear. All the three structures, vestibule, semicircular canals, cochlea, contain the the membranous portion. The membranous labyrinth contains the endolymph, and there is a space between the membranous labyrinth and the bony labyrinth. That particular gap between the membranous labyrinth and the bony labyrinth is filled by another fluid called the perilymph. Then when a transverse section of the cochlea is considered, that means now cochlea is a coiled tube. If we straighten up that coiled tube, then we can get a structure like an S-Lone tube. Then if we cut that perpendicularly, then we can obtain a circular cross section. So this is a circular cross section obtained when a transverse section when a transverse section of the cochlea is obtained, or if we cut the cochlea perpendicularly. So this is that transverse section. So we can see that there are three compartments of the cochlea. Upper vestibular canal, at the middle the cochlear duct, and at the base it is the tympanic canal. So those are the three compartments of the cochlea. So actually this cochlear duct, the middle portion, is a portion belonging to the membranous labyrinth. And as we can see, the upper and the lower portions are the upper and lower portions of the same thing. That is, they are two portions of that gap which is filled with perilymph, that gap between the membranous labyrinth and the bony labyrinth. that particular gap which is filled with perilymph, the upper portion is the vestibular canal and the lower portion is the tympanic canal. So vestibular canal and tympanic canal are filled with the perilymph, while cochlear duct, being a part of the membranous labyrinth, is filled with the endolymph. And we can see that there is a special structure. There are two special membranes that separate the cochlear duct from the vestibular canal and the tympanic canal. The membrane that separates the vestibular canal from the cochlear duct is a Reissner's membrane, while the membrane that separates the cochlear duct from the lower tympanic canal is called the basilar membrane. And we can see that there is a special structure on the basilar membrane. On to the next diagram. Now on the left side we can see the transverse section of the cochlea, as it's the same thing that I showed in the previous diagram. And if this particular structure that is present on the basilar membrane is enlarged, it is the diagram on the right side. The diagram on the right side is actually the enlarged view, the enlarged diagram of that particular structure that is found on the basilar membrane. So this structure is actually called the organ of Corti. So organ of Corti is found on the basilar membrane. So when we consider this organ of Corti, it is a very important structure because it contains the auditory receptor cells. It contains the auditory receptor cells or hair cells, hair receptor cells, which are the auditory receptors. And also it contains supportive cells, nerve fibers of the auditory nerve, the basilar membrane, and another membrane called the tectorial membrane. This tectorial membrane is very important because when we consider these sensory hair cells, these sensory hair cells have hairs on it. And these hairs are slightly in contact with the tectorial membrane. These hairs are slightly in contact with the tectorial membrane, and this contact is actually very important when it comes to creating a nerve impulse. We will be talking about it later in the physiology of hearing. So basically, if you are asked to write what are the parts of organ of Corti, then there are 5 main parts that should be mentioned. First, auditory receptor cells or sensory hair cells, supportive cells, nerve fibers of the auditory nerve, basilar membrane, and the tectorial membrane. Remember, even the basilar membrane is a part of the organ of Corti. Organ of Corti is found on the basilar membrane, but basilar membrane is also a part of the organ of Corti. Then we can move on to the functions of the human ear. So as a whole, the human ear has 2 main functions: hearing and equilibrium. Those are the 2 main functions of the human ear. Then first, moving on to hearing, vibrating objects produce pressure waves in surrounding air. In hearing, the ear transduces these pressure waves, which is a mechanical stimulus, into nerve impulses, and they are transmitted to the brain, which perceives the sound. So that's the outline of hearing. That's what happens. Then cochlea of the inner ear is involved in this. It is the cochlea that is involved in hearing. That's an important point. The organ of Corti has auditory sensory receptors in auditory hair cells that can convert the vibration energy of sound into an electric nerve impulse. Actually, these auditory receptors in the auditory hair cells are dendrites of sensory neurons that combine to form the auditory nerve that runs to the brain. So remember, auditory receptors are sensory neurons and they are found in the auditory hair cells. They can convert the vibration energy of sound into an electric nerve impulse. Now when the process of hearing is considered, in this diagram very clearly it has been shown using arrows. So what happens is this: the outer ear collects and concentrates the sound waves and directs them along the auditory canal towards the tympanic membrane. So these vibrations cause the tympanic membrane to vibrate. Tympanic membrane vibrations are then transmitted to the middle ear. Then the middle ear amplifies those vibrations of tympanic membrane by the movement of the 3 jointed ear ossicles. Right? So the amplification is done. Then The ear ossicles transmit the vibrations to the oval window, which is located on the membrane of the cochlear surface. That's common to the inner ear and the middle ear. Then when stapes vibrates against the oval window, we said that stapes covers the oval window. So when stapes vibrates against the oval window, pressure waves are created in the perilymph in the cochlea. So we should know that the vestibular canal of the cochlea is connected to the oval window, and the tympanic canal of the cochlea is connected to the round window. That's a very important point when it comes to the physiology of hearing. So when the vibrations are transmitted to the vestibular canal of the cochlea, it has the perilymph node, so the perilymph is vibrated. Then the vibrations are transmitted through the Reissner's membrane to the cochlear duct. The membranous labyrinth part. Then those vibrations are transmitted to the tympanic canal via the basilar membrane. Now we know that then when the vibrations are transmitted through the basilar membrane to the tympanic canal, we know that the organ of Corti lies on the basilar membrane, and the organ of Corti also tends to vibrate. Then what happens? The sensory hair cells of the organ of Corti are vibrated. Then the hairs on the sensory hair cells, the auditory receptor cells, are actually those hairs move against the tectorial membrane. Those hairs move against the tectorial membrane. So this motion of hairs of the hair cells can create a nerve impulse. Then this created nerve impulse is sent through the auditory sensory nerve fibers in the sensory hair cells, and then through the auditory nerve, this particular nerve impulse can be sent to the brain. That can be sent to the particular lobe of the brain. So then their sound can be perceived. So when this diagram is considered, once again we said that the vibrations are passed through the basilar membrane into the tympanic canal. Tympanic canal also contains perilymph. Then the perilymph is vibrated, and now this vibration should be removed from the ear, because if the vibration remains inside the ear and keeps vibrating the perilymph, then a new sound cannot be detected, new vibration cannot be detected. In that case, this vibration should be removed. That is why Eustachian tube is there. The Eustachian tube can equalize the air pressure within the ear and outside the ear. It maintains the same atmospheric pressure within the ear. So the vibration can be removed through the Eustachian tube. So the function of the Eustachian tube is to maintain the air pressure on both sides of the tympanic membrane at the atmospheric level. Then coming to the second function, that is equilibrium. Mainly vestibule, the utricle and saccule and semicircular canals are involved here. Cochlea was involved in hearing, and vestibule and semicircular canals are involved in equilibrium. Semicircular canals and vestibule located in the inner ear provide information about the position of the head in space and contribute to maintaining posture and balance. The vestibule has a structure called macula for this purpose. Utricle and saccule of the vestibule perceive position with respect to gravity or linear movements. For this purpose, ampullae, the swelling at the place where the three semicircular canals are connected to the utricle of semicircular canals, contain a structure called cupula. They detect angular movements of the head. So these are the main functions of the macula and cupula respectively. Then if we just look at the structure of cupula in ampullae and how it works, this is how it works. Now when we consider the three semicircular canals, we said that the three semicircular canals are arranged perpendicular to one another in three spatial planes of arrangement. There is a particular reason for that. When our head is rotated by us, then whatever the plane that our head gets in, there would be a semicircular canal that lies on that particular plane. So to ensure that there is one semicircular canal always that lies on the plane that our head is in, the three semicircular canals have been arranged in three perpendicular planes. Then when the structure ampulla is considered, we can see that it is a swelling at the place where utricle is connected to the semicircular canals, and when an ampulla is enlarged, we can observe the structure cupula inside it. So in the diagram B, we can see cupula. So it has sensory hair cells with cilia. Remember, cupula has cilia. Then when we consider the cupula, actually the sensory hair cells with cilia are embedded in a gelatinous cap. And this whole structure of cupula is actually present in the endolymph, because it is found on the membrane of the membranous labyrinth facing the side of endolymph, facing inwards. So it's found in the endolymph. So what happens, it's when it comes to the function of cupula, now when our head is rotated in a certain direction, opposite to that particular direction, endolymph and perilymph start to vibrate. Endolymph and perilymph vibrate, actually starts to flow in the opposite direction to the direction of movement of the body. Then what happens, it causes the gelatinous cap of cupula to move in the same direction of the endolymph and perilymph. That means even the cupula moves to the opposite direction of the direction of body movement. Then when the gelatinous cap moves, the cilia and the sensory hairs are stimulated, and that creates a nerve impulse, and the nerve impulse is transmitted through the particular nerve to the cerebellum of the brain, because we know cerebellum is responsible for posture and balance. Therefore cerebellum is contacted. The name of the nerve is actually not important. So this is the structure of cupula and how it works. Then coming to the structure of macula and how it works. Now this is found in the lining of the vestibule. This is found in the vestibule. So in the structure of the macula, we can see that there are sensory hair cells, but these don't have cilia like cupula does. Then when macula is considered, now we can see that the sensory hair cells are projected into a gelatinous cap once again, like cupula, and we can observe that there are some structures mentioned in blue color on the top of that gelatinous layer. Those blue color structures are called otoliths. Otoliths means actually calcium carbonate crystals. So these crystals are very important. Now when the functioning is considered, when the head is tilted, now macula is responsible for linear movements, and cupula is responsible for angular movements. So in macula, when head is tilted, linearly moved to a particular direction, these otoliths also move to the same direction, and then the hairs of the sensory hair cells also move to that same direction of the direction of body movement. Then what happens, that movement can create a nerve impulse, and that nerve impulse is sent via the particular required nerve to the cerebellum of the brain once again. So the name of the nerve is again not important, and remember, it is the cerebellum that is contacted in this case as well. So that is the structure of macula and how it works. Then basically, so that is actually the end of the functions of the ear. So basically we can line out or just sort out the functions of the three parts of the ear. Now these are not standard functions mentioned in the resource book. The standard functions are hearing and equilibrium, but knowing an outline is also important. It would be helpful. So when we consider the outer ear, what it does is it collects and directs sound waves to the middle ear. That's its function. Then middle ear is, when middle ear is considered, middle ear amplifies the sound waves received from the external environment and directed by the external ear. So amplification part is done by the middle ear. Then coming to the inner ear, there are two main functions: detection of sound, that is done by organ of Corti of cochlea, and maintain the equilibrium of the body, that is done by semicircular canals and the vestibule. Then we can talk about the last sensory organ mentioned, that is human skin. So this is a typical structure of the skin. So in this diagram the receptors haven't been marked. So here we can see the basic structures of the skin, and we can also see that there are two basic layers, the epidermis and the dermis. Epidermis is found outer epidermis is the outermost layer and dermis is the inner layer, and dermis is thicker than the epidermis. In human body, skin is the largest organ. It consists of two main layers, epidermis and the dermis. The layer underneath the skin is called the subcutaneous layer, which is composed of adipose tissue and areolar tissue. So, there is a fat layer underneath the skin called subcutaneous layer. Then when the epidermis is considered, it is the outermost layer of the skin which consists of stratified keratinized squamous epithelium. So simply, epidermis is a stratified keratinized squamous epithelium. So it has the basic features of this epithelium. So if we just look at the features, epidermis is not supplied with blood vessels, but its deeper layers are provided with nutrients and oxygen by the interstitial fluid, that means the lymph of the dermis, finally drained away as lymph. So, as a usual epithelial tissue, epidermis has no blood vessels, but its deeper layers are provided with nutrients and oxygen by the lymph in the dermis. Then, there are several layers of cells in the epidermis. The deepest layer is a germinative layer from which epidermal cells are originated constantly. So by cell division or mitosis, the germinative layer produces new layers of cells. These cells undergo gradual changes as they progress towards the surface of the skin. The cells on the surface are relatively flat, thin, non-nucleated and dead. And the cytoplasm has been replaced by keratin, which is a fibrous protein. So all these are basic characteristics of a stratified keratinized squamous epithelium. Surface cells are constantly rubbed off and replaced by the cells underneath. In areas where the skin is subjected to wear and tear, the epidermis is thicker, like palms and fingers of the hand and sole of the foot. The deeper germinative layer has cells with a dark pigment called melanin. So these cells with melanin are called melanocytes. The melanin pigment contributes to skin color. Actually, the main factor that contributes to skin color is the melanin pigment. If a person has more melanin pigment, that person tends to be rather more darker, and ones with less amount of melanin, such a person tends to be rather more fairer. But melanin pigment is not the only factor that contributes to skin color. There are two other additional factors that affect the skin color. They are extent of oxygen saturation in the circulating blood of the dermis and excessive levels of bile pigments and carotenes in the fat layer. So these two factors, along with the amount of melanin in melanocytes, contribute to skin color. So when the inner layer, dermis, is considered, dermis is composed of areolar connective tissue. So it is an areolar connective tissue. The matrix contains collagen fibers interlaced with elastic fibers. That means simply the matrix contains collagen fibers connected with elastin fibers. Collagen fibers bind water and gives the skin its tensile strength. So tensile strength to the skin is mainly, not the only thing, but mainly provided by collagen fibers. Then coming to the main cells found in the dermis, they are fibroblasts, macrophages and mast cells. So mainly fibroblasts, macrophages and mast cells are the main cells found in the dermis. Other cells are also found, since it's an areolar tissue. Other things are also found, but mainly collagen fibers, elastin fibers, and fibroblasts, macrophages and mast cells are the main cells. Then structures present in the dermis. Basically, there are blood vessels, lymph vessels, sensory nerve endings, and along with that, specially sweat glands, sebaceous glands, hairs, arrector pili muscles, and sensory receptors like Meissner's corpuscles, Pacinian corpuscles, free nerve endings, bulb of Krause, organ of Ruffini, and Merkel discs are found. So when this diagram is considered, we can clearly see the receptors of the human skin. So as I mentioned earlier, Meissner's corpuscles and Merkel discs, which are touch receptors, are located closer to the surface of the skin. They are sensitive to touch, that is why. Then when we consider Pacinian corpuscles, they are pressure receptors. So they are deep pressure receptors. Therefore, they are found in the deeper layers of the skin, because the pressure should be able to penetrate the skin in order to be detected as a pressure by the Pacinian corpuscles. Then we can also see Ruffini bodies and Clausen bulbs as well. Then also we can see the structure of a sweat gland, a sebaceous gland, a hair follicle, and the hairs that are projected above the skin surface as well. So that is the basic structure of a human skin. Then coming to the functions of the skin, there are 5 main functions. Actually, this order is also important. First, protection, regulation of body temperature, cutaneous sensation, synthesis of vitamin D, and excretion are the 5 main functions of the skin. Then coming to the first one, protection. The skin acts as a defensive barrier against invasion by microorganisms, entrance of chemicals and physical agents, and dehydration. We have learned that in microbiology, it can act as a physical barrier. Then, skin contains keratinized epithelium, which is relatively waterproof. This layer can protect deeper and more delicate structures of the skin. The skin contains specific immune cells which can phagocytose foreign invasions. The melanin pigments protect the skin against the harmful effects of UV radiation. So these are the basic facts that come under the first function, protection. So basically the protection to the skin is given by the keratinized epithelium, the epidermis. Then the second one, regulation of body temperature. This will be discussed elaborately in the last part of the lesson, that is homeostasis. So for now, knowing some points would be enough. The skin contributes to regulation of body temperature as it provides passage through which heat can be lost or gained depending on the body requirements. When body temperature is increased above the normal range, which is normally 37 degrees Celsius, sweat glands secrete sweats onto the skin surface. Now we know sweat contains excessive heat. So excessive heat can be removed by sweating. Then evaporation of sweat cools the body surface because it removes the heat. When heat stress, that means when the body temperature is increased too much than the normal range, heat loss can be promoted by increasing the blood flow through the skin capillaries by dilating arterioles. So superficial arterioles are dilated so that more blood moves through those arterioles, and more heat can be lost by radiation through the skin surface. Then when body temperature falls than the normal range, that means when body temperature drops beyond the normal range, heat loss through skin capillaries can be minimized by constricting arterioles in the dermis. So the opposite thing is done here. When the superficial arterioles are constricted, the amount of blood that flows through that decreases. Therefore, heat loss by radiation can be minimized. When cold stress means when the body temperature falls too much than the normal range, contraction of erector pili muscles attached to the hair can generate body heat and contribute to heat production. So contraction of erector pili muscles means actually the erection of the hairs of the body. So by that heat can be generated and heat production happens. Then cutaneous sensation. Skin contains sensory receptors which are sensitive to touch, pressure, temperature, and pain. Upon stimulation, nerve impulses are generated which are transmitted to the brain for sensory perception. So simply cutaneous sensation means the sensory function of the skin. Then synthesis of vitamin D. Exposure to sunlight can convert a lipid-based substance in the skin to vitamin D. So that is how vitamin D is produced in the skin. Then excretion. Skin serves as a minor excretory organ. Sodium chloride, urea, and aromatic substances such as garlic can be excreted in sweat. Actually, along with sweat, excessive heat in the body is also removed, but that's not considered as an excretory component. The main excretory components in sweat are sodium chloride, urea, and aromatic substances such as garlic. So that's the end of the functions of skin, and also that is the end of the second part of the lesson. I hope you found this video useful and informative for you, and I wish you all the very best for your A-level exam.